My parents called me a freak, but he made me feel loved for the first time. I never thought love was something I deserved. For as long as I can remember, I had been convinced that I was too broken to be loved, especially after everything that had happened in my past. Being autistic in a world that didn't understand me, with parents who seemed to despise my very existence, had left me shattered. But this story isn't just about pain and hopelessness. It's about the unexpected light that pierced through my darkest days. I was diagnosed with autism when I was 7. The word was foreign to me back then, but I could tell from the way my parents reacted that it was something they hated. From that day on, it felt like the gap between us grew wider, until it felt like an unbridgeable chasm. They wanted me to be someone I wasn't, and when I couldn't be that person, they turned on me. My mother was especially cruel. She'd say things like, "Why can't you just be normal?" Or, "Your sister is perfect, why aren't you?" My father, while less vocal, would give me these looks of disappointment that were somehow worse than the words. They weren't proud of me, not for anything I did, and I learned to exist quietly in their house, making myself as invisible as I could. Thankfully, my grandparents took me in when I turned 16. Living with them was a relief, a small escape from the constant judgment and criticism. They were gentle, loving people who accepted me as I was. But even with their support, the scars from my parents' words were deep. I carried their disapproval with me everywhere. It affected how I saw myself, how I believed others would see me. The first time I ever trusted someone, really trusted someone outside my family, was with a boy I dated when I was 20. Let's call him Jake. Jake was charming, and for a while, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't so unlovable after all. He was kind in the beginning, understanding of my quirks and the way I sometimes needed space to recharge. He made me feel like maybe I was worth something. But Jake had a dark side. Slowly, his patience wore thin. He started making comments similar to the ones my parents made. "Why can't you just act normal when we're with my friends?" he'd ask after I'd had a meltdown at a party. "Why do you always embarrass me?" His words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I had hoped that someone outside of my family might be different. But in the end, he wasn't. One night, after an especially difficult day, I overheard him talking to one of his friends. "I'm only with her because I feel bad for her," he said. "She's never going to find anyone else. She's too weird. But I'm done. I don't think I've ever felt so small in my life. To be pitied, not loved." I broke it off with him that night, tears stinging my eyes, feeling like I had lost the little bit of self-worth I'd managed to scrape together. After Jake, I decided I was done with love. I couldn't trust anyone not to hurt me the way he had. The way my parents had. A couple of years passed, and I threw myself into volunteer work. Helping others gave me a sense of purpose, a way to keep my mind busy and my heart closed. I'd been working with a charity that organized community events, and it was during one of these events that I met him. We were both on the committee for a fundraiser. He was friendly, professional, and treated everyone with a respect that I hadn't often experienced. At first, we only spoke about work. We'd brainstorm ideas for the event, organize logistics, and coordinate with volunteers. It was all very businesslike, and I liked it that way. I wasn't looking for anything beyond that. But slowly, our conversations became more personal. We'd talk about our lives between meetings, about things we liked, places we'd traveled, or funny moments from our day. He never pried, never made me feel like I had to share more than I was comfortable with. He was just easy to talk to. I found myself looking forward to our chats. There was something different about him, something warm and kind that I wasn't used to. I was cautious, though. My heart was still fragile, and I wasn't ready to let anyone in. It wasn't until he invited me to meet his family that I realized how different his world was from mine. I was hesitant at first, worried that his family would be like mine, judgmental, dismissive, and cold. But when I walked into their home, I felt something I had never felt before: warmth. Genuine warmth. His mother greeted me with a smile, pulling me into a hug before I could even introduce myself. His father shook my hand and welcomed me like I was already part of the family. His siblings were kind, asking me about my interests, genuinely interested in getting to know me. I didn't feel out of place. I didn't feel strange or different. For the first time in my life, I felt accepted. That night, as we sat around the dinner table, laughing and talking like I belonged there, something inside me started to heal. I didn't know it at the time, but I was beginning to fall in love. Not just with him, but with the idea that maybe, just maybe, I could be loved as I was. As things between us became more serious, I knew the time would come when I'd have to introduce him to my family. The thought filled me with dread. I had never told him much about my parents, only that we weren't close. I didn't want him to know the full extent of their cruelty. I was terrified that meeting them would scare him away, that he'd see me the way they did and realize I wasn't worth the trouble. But he insisted. He wanted to meet them, to understand more about my life. Reluctantly, I agreed, though every part of me screamed against it. The night we went to my parents' house for dinner, I felt sick with anxiety. My mother, always the actress, welcomed him with fake smiles and overly polite small talk. My father shook his hand but said little. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this would go okay. That hope was shattered at the dinner table. As we sat down to eat, my parents couldn't resist showing their true colors. My mother began with her usual backhanded comments. "It's a miracle she found someone like you," she said, looking at him with an expression that made me feel like an insect under a microscope. "I didn't think anyone would ever want her." My father chimed in. "You could do better, you know. Her sister is much more charming." I felt like I was sinking into the floor. My heart pounded in my chest, my stomach twisted in knots. I didn't look at him, afraid of what I'd see in his eyes. Would he agree with them? Would he realize they were right? Would he leave me, just like Jake had? But instead, he calmly placed his fork down and looked directly at my parents. "I can't believe you would speak about your daughter this way," he said, his voice steady but filled with anger. "She is the most incredible person I've ever met, and I'm honored to be with her. You should be ashamed of how you've treated her." My mother's mouth dropped open, and my father's face turned red with anger, but they were speechless. He wasn't done. "If you can't see how amazing she is, that's your loss," he continued. "But let me be clear, until you apologize to her, you will not be invited to our wedding." And with that, he took my hand and led me out of the house. We didn't finish the dinner. We didn't even say goodbye. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from relief. Relief that he had stood up for me, that he hadn't run away like I feared he would. That night, I cried harder than I ever had before. Part of me was devastated, the pain of my parents' cruelty never got easier to bear. But another part of me, a part that had been buried deep for so long, felt something new. Relief. He had chosen me. He had seen all the ugliness and chosen to stay. Time passed, and soon enough, our wedding day arrived. It was the happiest day of my life. His family had welcomed me into their world with open arms, treating me like one of their own long before the wedding took place. Their love, their kindness, their acceptance, it had healed so much of the pain I'd carried for so long. My parents didn't come. I hadn't expected them to. Instead, they sent a letter, a hateful message, telling me they didn't feel ashamed of how they treated me. They said I was a freak, and they'd be ashamed to attend my wedding. It's strange, but reading that letter didn't hurt as much as I thought it would. I guess it's because I no longer needed their approval. I had found a new family. One that loved me for who I was. One that saw me as someone worthy of love, not someone broken. As I stood there, looking into his eyes, surrounded by the people who had become my family, I felt a peace I had never known before. Thank you, Aaron. My beloved husband.